The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant cooking fires. Char crouched low in the bush, her entire body trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest like the village drummer's urgent call during an emergency meeting. Sweat dripped down her forehead despite the night's cold embrace. She had never known fear like this. Before her, in the pale moonlight, she saw Ikenna's lifeless body sprawled on the ground. The knife in his stomach gleamed ominously, its handle catching the moon's glow. His unblinking eyes were turned towards her, and she saw the glistening trail of tears that had escaped before his final breath. His lips trembled as if he had tried to call her name, but his voice had failed him. Charles shifted her gaze to the two men standing over the body, Samuel, Ikenna's uncle, and his closest friend, Toba. Their voices were hushed, but Char could make out their heated whispers. If we throw him into the river just like this, the body will resurface in a few days. People will ask questions, Samuel said, rubbing his chin. Toba shook his head. We tie him to a heavy stone, and he will never be found. It must be a secret between us, a secret we take to our graves. Char's stomach turned. She wanted to scream, to run to Ikenna and shake him awake, to tell him this was all a nightmare. But she knew she had to remain hidden. If they saw her, she would be next. She watched in horror as the two men carried Ikenna's body and tied it to a large stone. Then, they placed it inside a canoe and paddled silently towards the deepest part of the river. The sound of the water swallowing Ikenna's body was the final blow to Char's sanity. As soon as the canoe drifted out of sight, she ran. Char ran so fast that her feet barely touched the ground. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind racing faster than her legs. She burst into her father's compound, where she found him seated outside, reading an old newspaper and listening to the radio. Her stepmother was by the fire, stirring a pot of yam pottage. Where have you been? Her stepmother snapped, glaring at her. Come and pound this yam before I send you to bed hungry. Char obeyed, her hands shaking as she lifted the pestle. Her heart was still in the bush, with Ikenna's lifeless eyes staring into hers. When her grip faltered, her stepmother slapped her across the face. Are you deaf? If you don't do it properly, you will sleep on an empty stomach, you useless child. Char bit her lip and forced herself to focus, but her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up and saw Samuel and Toba entering the compound. Chi-Chi, Samuel greeted, calling her by the name he always used. His voice was smooth, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. Good evening, sir, she stammered, lowering her gaze. Samuel patted her back. Be a good girl, my dear. Then he turned to her father and engaged him in conversation. Char's hands turned to ice. Had they seen her in the bush? Had they come to silence her? She stole a glance at them. They weren't looking at her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something. The next day at school, an assembly was called. Mr. Samuel stood on the podium. It has come to my attention that Ikenna has gone missing. His mother is very worried. If anyone has seen him, come to my office and tell me. Char clenched her fists. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell the whole school that the very man standing before them was responsible for Ikenna's disappearance. But who would believe her? Samuel was a respected teacher. She was just a girl with no mother, raised by a stepmother who despised her. That evening, she went to Ikenna's mother's house. The woman was seated outside, weeping. You were his best friend, Kyoma. Where is my son? She sobbed, clutching Char's clothes. Char couldn't say a word. She just stared, her own tears mixing with those of the grieving mother. The other women scolded her. Leave! You are only making things worse. She walked away, her heart heavy. Who could she trust with the truth? Her father? Number. He was too close to Samuel. The police? They would laugh at her. Then she thought of someone, Mrs. Emira, her kind-hearted teacher. The next day, after class, Mrs. Emira asked her to stay behind. Char, what's wrong? You failed your test, and you've been acting strangely. Char hesitated. Then she whispered, I know what happened to Ikenna. Mrs. Emira's eyes widened. What do you mean? Char took a deep breath and told her everything. When she finished, Mrs. Amira sat in a stunned silence. Then she said, "You must not tell anyone else. I will handle this." That evening, Mrs. Amira followed Toba to Samuel's office and eavesdropped on their conversation. She pulled out her phone and recorded them as they discussed not only Ikenna's murder, but their plans to kill his mother. The next morning, she took the recording to the village king. The king summoned Samuel, Toba, and the entire village. Under pressure, the men denied everything. But when the king sent fishermen to search the river, they found Ikenna's body, still tied to the stone. Mrs. Ojiwa, Ikenna's mother, collapsed in grief. The villagers gasped in horror. Samuel and Toba were immediately arrested. In their desperation, they confessed not only to killing Ikenna, but also to murdering his father to take his wealth. The village elders sentenced them to life in prison. Char was taken in by the king, who admired her bravery. He gave her a scholarship to study wherever she wished. No longer would she live under the cruelty of her father and stepmother. She was free. The village buzzed with the news for weeks. The story of the girl who brought down murderers became legend, but for Char, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that Ikenna finally had justice.